Recollections and memories. We have been collecting them for 125 years. These memories are perhaps the biggest part of what makes college football the game it is today. Recollections of its heroes and their now legendary accomplishments. And the stories of the great leaders who inspired them. Our memories reflect the color of a century and a quarter of autumn afternoons. Over the years, these recollections have become history, and that history has become tradition. Through birth, growth, and change, college football has gone from its beginnings as a curiosity to now America's Saturday afternoon. It is a game of simple emotions raised to the level of passion. Young men learning to go beyond themselves, making the remarkable commonplace. It is tradition and memory, legends and heroes. This is the story of college football. Welcome to college football's 125th anniversary, a season of celebration. And hello again, everyone. I'm Chris Lincoln. In the next hour, we will celebrate college football from its very first game to this, its 125th season. We'll spend time with some of the heroes of the past and watch the games that made them legends. You'll see how football has changed from its rules and playing fields to the ball itself. And in 1994, a football like this will be used in more than 5,600 games at over 560 college campuses across America. So get ready. The game is about to kick off. The very beginning of college football is straight ahead. What is recognized as the first intercollegiate football game ever pitted Princeton against Rutgers on November 6, 1869. Teams then were 25 men on a side. Running with the ball was illegal, and goals were scored by kicking the round ball through soccer-style goalposts. By the way, Rutgers won 6-4. Over the next decade, the game developed. There were now 11 players on a side in a rugby-like game, and on the championship Yale team of 1876 was a freshman who'd become one of the most influential figures in the history of football, Walter Camp. In a career that spanned 50 years as a player, coach, and innovator, Camp almost single-handedly transformed football from its beginnings into a game we'd recognize today. Camp replaced continuous rugby-style play with plays from scrimmage, introduced the concepts of downs and yards to go, the beginnings of a modern scoring system, and created the first All-American team. It's easy to understand why Walter Camp is now known as the father of American football. The 1888 Yale team, coached by Camp, featured a young, undersized end named Amos Alonzo Stagg, who took Camp's teachings and helped spread the game beyond the big three schools of Yale, Harvard, and Princeton. Stagg coached the University of Chicago for 41 seasons, leading them to a national championship in 1905, and coached the University of the Pacific until 1946, when he was 84. Stagg is credited with introducing the forward pass into football that was made legal in 1906. The Michigan teams of 1901 to 1905, led by their star back Willie Heston, dominated the turn of the century with the amazing record of 55 wins, 1 loss, and 1 tie. This film is the earliest known motion pictures of any football game, depicting the Yale-Princeton game of 1902, and was produced by the studios of Thomas Alva Edison. Football of the turn of the century was dominated by mass interference plays such as the Flying V, where players formed a single mass to plow through the opposition. This created a violent game with frequent fights and sometimes even death, with 18 football fatalities in 1905. President Teddy Roosevelt intervened and threatened to ban the game unless it was cleaned up. This led directly to the formation of the NCAA in 1906. In 1907, Glenn Pop Warner coached a freshman at the Carlisle Indian School of Pennsylvania named Jim Thorpe, bringing together two of the sport's legendary names. This rare action photo of Thorpe on the field, recently restored from a damaged negative, is being shown here for the first time. As college football developed, down and yardage, scoring rules, and field dimensions were updated to those we know today. The forward pass would become more common, though a drop pass still resulted in a 15-yard penalty. It wasn't until 1913 when Notre Dame defeated favorite Army 35-13, mostly on the passing of quarterback Gus Duraeus to an end named Knute Rockne, that the forward pass was recognized as a reliable offensive weapon. At Georgia Tech, Coach John Heisman, from whom the famous trophy was later named, was the first to divide the game into 4 quarters. He was, though, a show no-quarter coach and led Tech to the most lopsided win in the history of the game. In 1916, his Yellow Jackets beat tiny Cumberland College of Tennessee 222-0. As a season of celebration continues, one of America's true sporting legends, Notre Dame's great Knute Rockne. The 1920s were a great and prosperous decade in America, and the same can be said for college football. The game had risen from its rough beginnings to a big show, with razzle-dazzle plays that brought fans to stadiums around the country every Saturday, in what was now a tradition over 50 years old. This was college football's first golden decade. Notre Dame has long been one of college football's golden teams, and if any one man was responsible for the growth of the Irish program, it was Knute Rockne. Under Rockne through the 20s, Notre Dame lost less than a dozen games and won 3 national championships. His playing experience in the sport's infancy enabled Rockne to lead the next generation of Irish through his innovative training techniques, many of which are still in use. Rockne was also known as a great motivator. His halftime speeches were said to range from fighting Irish bah to long emotional pleas, but whatever they were, they worked. In his most famous halftime talk, of course, Rockne invoked the spirit of George Gipp, the Irish All-American of 1920, asking one of his worst teams of the decade to rally over Army as they did here 12-6 in 1928. Another of college football's great legends was Rockne's backfield of the early 20s. Layden, Miller, Crowley, Stuhldreher, the 4 horsemen of Notre Dame. According to Rockne, what brought the 4 to prominence was the famed Notre Dame shift.
Without the shift, we would never have had the 4 horsemen in football. They averaged and weighed 157 pounds. The shift enabled them to use their speed and their intelligence and their ability to finesse the other fella.
6, 49, 22. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2.
The Notre Dame shift was really college football's first backfield in motion. The 4 fleet backfield men shifted into a box formation, confusing defenses as to who would carry the ball and where. The man responsible will always be synonymous with college football, Knute Rockne. Another of college football's lasting legends got his first nickname from his hometown summer job. He was the Wheaton Iceman, Harold Red Grange of Illinois. Grange was one of the first players to receive the new adulation the media accorded sporting heroes in the 20s. The great sports writer Grantland Rice gave Grange his other nickname, the Galloping Ghost. The first of the great open field runners, Rice called him a streak of fire, a breath of flame. In 1924, here against a Michigan team undefeated in 20 games, Grange took the opening kick in for the first of his 4 TDs in the first 12 minutes of play. Players rarely came out of games in those days, but Coach Bob Zupke agreed that Grange deserved a break. After taking himself out for a rest, Grange returned to score 1 more and throw for another. 6 touchdowns and 402 yards total offense, all by himself. Another great individual achievement came in the same year, 1924, what was already the annual service classic, the Army-Navy game. This year, President Herbert Hoover came out to watch as Captain Ed Garvish of Army drop-kicked 4 field goals, including including this 42-yarder, scoring all the cadet points in their 12-0 defeat of Navy, and setting a record for successful kicks in one game. The largest crowd then to see a football game, 110,000 fans in Chicago's Soldiers Field, saw the cadets and middies square off again in the last game of 1926. Number 1 in the nation, favored Navy, had won their first 9 games and went up early as Tom Hamilton completed this 38-yarder to Hank Hardwick, setting up the score by Caldwell and a 7-0 Navy lead. In the second quarter, after Navy had added another score, upstart Army brought in its freshman stars, and Harry Light Horse Wilson, number 10, ignited Army on the ground. Later in that drive, Wilson scored the cadets' first touchdown. Later in that same quarter, Navy fumbled a punt reception, and Army recovered forward into the end zone to tie the game at 14. After the half, Army's Chris Cagle broke into the clear on this 44-yard touchdown run to put Army in front for the first time. Wilson's third point after gave the cadets a 21-14 lead. As darkness fell and on the game's last drive, Navy scored again to preserve the tie at 21, but ended the season number 2. One of the most famous games of the 20s and of all time was the 1929 Rose Bowl, which pitted Georgia against Cal. This game will always be remembered, though, for one of football's great gaffes, when Cal center Roy Riegels picked up a fumble and went 66 yards the wrong way.
I picked the ball up and dodging players. I got completely turned and I headed for the opposite goal. I ran down on the other end of the field. Benny Lum chasing me, telling me you're going the wrong way. I couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. My idea was to get down there as fast as I could and make that touchdown. And Benny was yelling, throw me the ball, throw me the ball. I wasn't about to throw the ball. I was making that touchdown myself. I know I sat there on the ground, and if a hole could have opened in the turf and I could have crawled in it, I would have been the happiest man in the world. All the times that I've run across or heard people saying wrong way, though they weren't referring to me, I immediately turned around to see if they were speaking about me.
Cal lost that Rose Bowl 8-0, but no one remembers that score. What they do remember was wrong ways run. The 30s saw further development in college football. The ball itself had changed much from the game's early days. It was now more oblong. This allowed the emergence of the quarterback as a pure thrower, like Slingin' Sammy Baugh of TCU. In an era when 10 passes a game was extravagant, Baugh threw 30 or 40 and had 38 touchdowns in 3 seasons.
Late in the ball game, Sammy Baugh drops back, fakes one, tails a long one. It's good inside the 10-yard line. Slingin' Sam's got to do it. He hits his man in the end zone for the winning touchdown.
Baugh was followed by Davy O'Brien as the Horned Frogs quarterback. Though only 5'7", O'Brien led the nation in passing yards in 1938. And college football's yearly award to its top passer still bears his name. Of course, the great quarterbacks had to have great receivers, and the greatest of them all was Don Hutson of Alabama, the first of the fleet modern pass catchers. Hutson used to say, "I just run like the devil," and quarterback Dixie Howell got the ball there. The Alabama Antelope invented catching the ball in traffic and then making the most of the play with his speed. Another great figure of the 30s was Jay Berwanger of one of the last teams at Chicago. In 1935, they didn't have a winning team, but they did have the country's best back in Berwanger, who that year won the first Heisman Trophy given to college football's best player by New York's Downtown Athletic Club.
When I came back from New York, I didn't have a place to keep it. I had an aunt that lived on the north side of Chicago, and I gave it to her, and she used it for a doorstop.
Tom Harmon of Michigan was the quintessential back in the days leading up to World War II. His power and speed tore up opposing defenses, making Harmon an All-American in 1939 and 40. Also in 1940, Harmon won the Heisman Trophy. But that year is perhaps best remembered for the Cal game, when a fan tried to stop Harmon when the defense couldn't. When we return, one of the greatest games by one of the game's greatest backs, Jim Brown. The 1940 season brought a revolution to college football with a recycle coach recycling an old formation. Clark Shaughnessy, whose team the year before at Chicago had scored only 37 points to their opponent's 307, was hired by Stanford and immediately installed the T formation, a throwback to turn-of-the-century flying wedge football, the backfield forming a T behind center. Shaughnessy's quarterback in the T was a converted tailback named Frankie Albert, and together they changed football forever. Shaughnessy's version of the T was not straight-ahead power football, but a weave of motion, deception, quick blocking patterns, and speed. What we now know as the option, veer, wishbone, and pro set were all derivatives of Stanford's T. And with this formation, the Indians went from one win the year before to going undefeated in 1940 and beating Nebraska 21-13 in the Rose Bowl, finishing second in the nation. The most celebrated backfield duo of the 40s was Army's Glenn Davis and Doc Blanchard, Mr. Inside and Mr. Outside. Blanchard was Mr. Inside with power to carry him through almost any line and plenty of quick in the clear. Davis was Mr. Outside with speed to burn and moves that left opposing secondaries wondering what happened. Playing for legendary Army coach Colonel Earl Blake, Davis and Blanchard are the only backfield pair to be three-time All-Americans and the only pair in history to both win the Heisman Trophy. Army co-captains, they are seen here in the Army-Navy game of 1946, in the first known color footage of any college football game. In the war years at Army, Davis and Blanchard piled up some amazing statistics. In 1945, they scored 37 touchdowns between them, while averaging only 9 and 11 carries per game. And Davis led the nation at 11.5 yards per carry. Excelling in all phases of the game, this pair gave the Army faithful lots to cheer about. But staking the claim to top team of the decade was Coach Frank Leahy of Notre Dame. His offensive star of the same year was number 32, Johnny Lujack. The Irish quarterback in their version of the T, Lujack made the offense go in the air and on the ground. He would follow Davis and Blanchard in winning the Heisman in 1947. But the year before, Yankee Stadium in New York was host to 74,000 fans, including a recently victorious General Eisenhower, who came to see the two powerhouse teams square off for the nation's #1 ranking in one of college football's classic battles. What had been touted as a matchup of offensive stars became a game of great defense. On the Statue of Liberty, Davis gives to Blanchard, but Notre Dame's line refused to allow Blanchard to use his head-up power. And they also were able to hem in Glenn Davis's great speed. Army seemed to get a break in the second quarter when Notre Dame's Gompers fumbled a punt. But Lujack was there to scoop the ball up and save the return. And when Lujack led the blocking for Red Sitko on a reverse, the play was saved for Army by Glenn Davis with that big stick. Lujack made a save of his own on this shoestring tackle of Davis, preserving a 0-0 tie and the national title for Notre Dame, one of their 4 in the decade. The most renowned back of the late 40s was Doak Walker of SMU. With the country basking in post-war harmony, Walker was the media's darling, a 3-time All-American who also won the Heisman in 1948. Halfback Walker combined speed and deception and had that special ability of finding a way to win. They called him the Miracle Man, and here on this deceptive keeper, it's easy to see why. In the great football days of the late decade, Doak Walker was it. Walker's high school teammate in Dallas, Bobby Lane, decided on Texas for college, and this All-American quarterback led the Longhorns to victories in the Cotton and Sugar Bowls. Walker's backfield partner in 48 and 49 was baby-faced Kyle Rote, whose speed and power complemented Walker's skills perfectly for the Mustangs. Another star at the end of the decade, and surely one of college football's great nicknames, was Charlie Choo Choo Justice of North Carolina. Just 5'10" and 165 pounds, but farm-bred tough. Choo Choo was known for his head-bobbing, galloping stride. He was a hero in a state not accustomed to football stars, and one of the men that made the 40s a great era in college football. Throughout the 1950s, Bud Wilkinson and his Oklahoma Sooners were college football's dominant team. In the decade, they were 93-10-2 and won 3 national titles. In those days, OU had great players like Billy Vessels, Jim Weatherall, and Kurt Burris. But the Sooners were best known for their 3 straight perfect seasons beginning in 1954 and a 47-game winning streak that stretched from 1953 through most of the 57 season. But 3 games from their 4th straight perfect campaign, OU lost to Notre Dame, the last team to beat them 4 years earlier, ending the win streak and getting shut out for the first time in an amazing 123 games. Other great figures of the 50s include Iowa's Alex Karras, All-American in 56 and 57, leading Iowa to the 56 Big Ten title. There was Mike Ditka, the picture of tough Western Pennsylvania football at Pitt, where he set the model for the modern tight end. The Irish had their golden boy, Paul Hornung, who became the 5th Notre Dame player to capture the Heisman Trophy in 1956. Just one of the era's football heroes was number 16, Southern Cal's Frank Gifford. Georgia had a mobile young quarterback, then known as Frank Tarkenton. But the most dominant performance by any player, perhaps of all time, came from Syracuse's Jim Brown in 1956. In his last game as a collegian against Colgate, the 6'2", 228-pound Brown scored 6 touchdowns, kicked 7 extra points, made TD saving tackles, and even kicked off in setting an NCAA record, scoring a total of 43 points, a record which stood for 35 years. As this season of celebration continues, college football explodes through the 60s. The decade of the 60s really saw the development of college football into the game we know today. As the decade opened, substitution rules were liberalized, leading to a more specialized and wide-open game. bringing to an end the days of the two-way players. As college football grew, so did its popularity, as over 200 million fans filled the stands, not to mention the hundreds of millions watching at home, making the 60s perhaps the greatest decade in college football's history.
College football in the 1960s seemed to be an endless parade of big players meeting in big games. College football in America was huge. Two-time All-American at Kansas, Gale Sayers led the nation with over 7 yards of carry in 1962 and was known for his breakaway speed that would make opposing defenses seem to disappear. With the end of the two-way days, Dick Butkus of Illinois was the model for the new modern middle linebackers, the defensive signal callers. The 6'3", 237-pound Butkus made people forget that Ray Nitschke had played at Illinois as he prowled the defense in search of contact. In 1963, Butkus recorded 144 tackles, caused 7 fumbles, and led Illinois to the Big Ten title. Known for his ferocity, it was said that if rain canceled practice, Butkus would get morose and angry. Another great defender was Michigan State's Bubba Smith, a two-time All-American and a part of a 1965 Spartan defense that held opponents to 45 yards rushing per game. Smith had not only size but speed. As seen here, watch him come from the bottom of the screen all the way across the field to track down a kick return, saving a touchdown. Texas had Tommy Novus, who seemed to have defense tattooed across his forehead, with another two-time All-American patrolling the middle for the Longhorns. Texas coach in those days was Darrell Royal, who led the Longhorns to national championships in 1963 and '69. Royal was known for his conservative, grinding offense. He is credited with the philosophy, if you put the ball in the air, only 3 things can happen, and 2 of them are bad. But there was some throwing going on in the 60s. At Navy, a midshipman wearing number 12 was making waves. Roger Staubach, who before graduating as an ensign led the nation twice in completion percentage and won the Heisman Trophy in 1963. Staubach's scrambling also earned him the nickname Roger the Dodger, long before his days in the NFL. The 1964 Cotton Bowl saw number 2 Navy versus number 1 Texas, who had some surprises planned. Staubach set Cotton Bowl passing records with 21 completions for 228 yards, but Texas seemed to contain him when it counted. And with Navy in a 9-man front, conservative Texas went airborne. Longhorn quarterback Duke Carlisle amassed 267 total yards as Texas beat Navy 28-6. A strategic victory for Coach Royal and bad memories for Staubach.
Squeaker, 28-6. You know, we got beat. We got all my friends here. Now I'm a Texan now, living in Dallas, and I talked to a couple 100,000 people who were personally at that game. Cotton Bowl only seats 75,000, so I am tired of hearing about that game. But
Joe Willie Namath went from Beaver Falls, PA to Alabama, where he led Bear Bryant's Tide to a national title in 1964. Other great quarterbacks of the 60s were Purdue's Bob Greasy, who led the Boilermakers to a Rose Bowl victory in 1967, and UCLA's Gary Beban, who took home the Heisman that year. And at the end of the decade, Archie Manning's success at Ole Miss led their fans to call themselves Archie's Army. Arkansas's Frank Broyles, coach of the Razorbacks for 19 years, taking the Hogs to 10 bowl games and the national title in 1964.
All right, Chuck, let's go. Good release now. They're going to be knocking the devil out of them.
In 1969, one of several of the 60s games of the decade took place in Fayetteville as President Richard Nixon came to watch top-ranked Texas take on number 2 Arkansas in a fight for the national title. Arkansas's defense smothered the feared Texas wishbone early, and Arkansas took the lead 14-0. But on the first play of the fourth quarter, Texas quarterback James Street finally broke free on this 42-yard TD. And followed it with a two-point conversion. Arkansas 14-8. Then later at 4th and 3, Coach Royal surprised Arkansas as Street threw this 44-yarder to Randy Peschel, setting up Jim Bertelson's TD for the 15-14 win and the national title. One of the college game's enduring figures was Coach Woody Hayes of Ohio State. He coached the Buckeyes for 28 years, from 1951 to 1978, bringing them to 12 bowl appearances and 5 national titles with his hard-nosed, 3 yards in a cloud of dust brand of football. The Buckeyes' Big Ten rivalry with Michigan is legend, and in 1969, the Buckeyes went to Ann Arbor to face the Wolverines' then rookie coach Bo Schembechler. Top-ranked Ohio State scored first as Rex Kern handed off to Jim Otis, but the Buckeyes missed the point after. Michigan fullback Garvey Craw came right back to give the Big Blue the lead 7-6. In the second quarter, Ohio State scored to make it 12-7, but on the point after, Michigan was called for offsides. This prompted Hayes to try for 2 to make up for the earlier miss, but Rex Kern was stopped behind the line. Michigan scored 2 touchdowns and a field goal to take a 24-12 lead into the second half. Then the Wolverine defense prevailed, totaling 6 interceptions on the day. Schembechler went on to be named Coach of the Year in 1969. In the 60s at Notre Dame, what was called the Era of Era began. And in 1966, Coach Ara Parseghian brought his top-ranked Fighting Irish to East Lansing, Michigan, to face number 2 Michigan State in a battle for number 1 in the most watched college game of its time. In the second quarter, the Spartans' Gene Washington caught this 42-yarder. And then Regis Cavender took it over from the 5 for a 7-0 Michigan State lead. Just minutes later, and in sub-freezing temperatures, State's Dick Kenny barefooted this 47-yard field goal to lead 10-0. Notre Dame, with Coley O'Brien replacing injured starter Terry Hanratty, got back in it on this strike to Bob Gladjo. The Irish tied the game at 10 in the fourth quarter on Joe Azzero's field goal. But then Coach Parseghian turned conservative. With the ball and 2.5 minutes to play, Parseghian chose to run the clock out and protect the tie rather than risk interception by his third-string quarterback. Parseghian was much criticized, but Notre Dame stayed number 1 and were crowned national champion. Another great coach was making his mark in warmer weather, John McKay of USC. His Trojans were national champs twice in the 60s, behind the running of the famed SC tailbacks, beginning with Mike Garrett. Only 5'9", Garrett seemed to be all legs as he led the nation in rushing and won the Heisman in 1965. The next great Trojan tailback was a junior college transfer from San Francisco who would forever leave his mark on college football, O.J. Simpson. At 6'2" and over 200 pounds, Simpson also ran the 100 in 9.4, making him a combination of power and speed unseen since the days of Jim Brown. He was also a workhorse, carrying the ball sometimes 30 and 40 times a game, with one thought in mind: yardage.
Yeah, I guess it's like Vince Lombardi said, run the daylight, you know. But really, I think it's best when you're not thinking about anything. You're just running on instinct, and I guess the only thought in your mind is daylight, you know, get those yards. And
A matchup with number 1 UCLA in 1967 brought Simpson to national attention in a game for the right to go to the Rose Bowl. This second quarter TD, with Simpson dragging 3 men into the end zone, gave USC a 14-7 lead. In the third, Heisman winner Gary Bevan threw 53 yards to George Farmer to tie the score at 14. Bevan threw another TD in the fourth, but the Bruins missed the point after and led 20-14. The following kickoff was taken by a tired Simpson, and he almost broke it. Then at 3rd and 3, at his own 36, O.J. got the call again. After jumping through the line for the first down, Simpson found his daylight and cut right for a 64-yard score to tie the game. The point after sent USC to the Rose Bowl, and they became national champions. When we come back, some Hurricanes and a bear. Another great #1 versus #2 came on Thanksgiving Day 1971, Nebraska at Oklahoma. On the game's first series, Nebraska's Johnny Rodgers took an Oklahoma punt at his own 28, somehow escaped a swarm of Sooners, and went 72 yards for the game's first touchdown. Later in the fourth quarter, down 28-24 and facing 4th and 6, Jack Mildren put Oklahoma ahead 31-24. Only to have the Huskers' Jeff Kinney come right back to give Nebraska the win, an undefeated season, and the national title. But it was Oklahoma who became one of the dominant teams of the 70s. The tradition of great Sooner backs started with Greg Pruitt, who averaged over 9 yards a carry in 1971. The tradition continued through Joe Washington to Billy Sims, who won the Heisman as a junior in 1978 while leading the nation with over 1,700 yards in 11 games that year, scoring 20 touchdowns for Sooner coach Barry Switzer. Archie Griffin of Ohio State became the only two-time winner of the Heisman Trophy in 74 and 75, while Texas had the power of Earl Campbell, who won the award in 77, gaining over 4,400 yards for the Hornets. But Tony Dorsett was better than them all, going over 6,000 yards in 4 years at Pitt. Great college quarterbacks of the 70s included Stanford's Jim Plunkett, Notre Dame's Joe Theismann, and USC's Pat Hayden, who led the Trojans in a 55-point comeback against Notre Dame in 1974. The 70s were also the era of the big kickers, with barefoot Tony Franklin at Texas A&M, Steve Little at Arkansas, Russell Erxleben, who along with Franklin set the NCAA record for distance 67 yards. The 70s were also the time of the Bear, Paul Bear Bryant of Alabama, whether in his game day hat, in the tower at practice, or at the halftime chalkboard. These images of Bryant are the very picture of a college coach. He was named Coach of the Year twice in the 70s, as the Crimson Tide won 3 national titles. In the 1979 Sugar Bowl, against previously unbeaten Penn State, the Tide ran its wishbone to perfection and swarmed all over the powerful Nittany Lions for the upset 14-7 and a share of the national championship. Beginning in the 70s, Penn State rose to prominence behind players like John Cappelletti, who converted from being a defensive back in 1971 to win the Heisman in 1973. Later in the decade, the Nittany Lions were led by All-American quarterback Chuck Fusina. But behind it all was the man in the glasses, Coach Joe Paterno. Behind Paterno, Penn State made 13 straight bowl appearances through the 70s and early 80s, including a win over Georgia in the 82 Sugar Bowl that gave Paterno his first national title. Leading those Georgia Bulldogs was number 34 Herschel Walker, who powered his way to over 5,200 yards in only 3 years. Other college football memories of the 80s include Dan Marino, who presaged his pro career with 34 touchdown passes in 1981 at Pitt. The Auburn Tigers had speed to burn in Bo Jackson, who won the Heisman in 1985. Eric Dickerson averaged 7 yards a carry in 1982 for the SMU Mustangs. In the 1984 Orange Bowl, Bernie Kosar and a cocky Miami Hurricane beat Tom Osborne's 12-0 and #1 ranked Nebraska Cornhuskers when a 2-point Nebraska conversion was batted away in the final minute. This signaled the rise of Florida football, capped in 1987 when Miami and Florida State were ranked 1 and 2 in the country. In the 87 Fiesta Bowl, though, Penn State stopped Miami's Vinny Testaverde with a last-second interception.
Testaverde throws. It is intercepted. It is intercepted. Pete Giftopoulos, his second of the game, and Penn State will win the national championship.
And who can forget this moment in 1984?
Game, folks, as Flutie takes the snap. He drops straight back, has some time. Now scrambles away from one hit. Looks, uncorks a deep one for the end zone. Phelan is down there.
Oh, he got it!
Did he get it?
He got it!
Touchdown! 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 Touchdown, Boston College! He did it! He did
Barry
it!
Sanders ran for more than 230 yards a game in 1988 for Oklahoma State. And in 1985, Eddie Robinson of Grambling passed Bear Bryant to become the winningest coach in college football history. And the 90s aren't even half over. And already we've seen many great things in college football. The fleet feet of Notre Dame's Rocket Ismail. Ty Detmer continuing BYU's great quarterback tradition. In 1991, Marshall Faulk's 44 points, 7 touchdowns, and a 2-point conversion broke Jim Brown's single-game scoring mark. Great games of the 90s have to include Alabama's upset of Miami in the 93 Sugar Bowl, when the Tide defense shut off the vaunted Miami offense. And the seesaw battle in South Bend that saw another last-second Boston College win, this time off the foot of kicker David Gordon. And at the end of last season in the Orange Bowl, Florida State took the lead 18-16. And when this Nebraska field goal try for the win failed, head coach Bobby Bowden had his first national title after 17 seasons leading the Seminoles. When we return, some of college football's wilder moments. Since we've brought you 125 years of college football's greatest hits, we thought you might enjoy a few more. Other memories that don't fit into a straight-line history of the game include the Washington connection. Dwight Eisenhower played for Army in the early teens before breaking his leg. Bobby Kennedy's letter at Harvard foreshadowed the legendary Kennedy family touch football games. President Richard Nixon played in his college days at Whittier in California, while his successor Gerald Ford was an all-star center at Michigan in the 30s. But this young man turned out to be the best Washingtonian of them all. Byron Whizzer White, playing at the University of Colorado in 1937, led the nation in rushing, scoring, and total yardage before going on to his second career as Associate Justice on the Supreme Court. These are pictures of the 1916 Rose Bowl, pitting Washington State against Brown of Rhode Island. Brown had one of the first African-American stars of the college game, halfback Fritz Pollard, but he gained only 46 yards in the mud that day, and the Cougars beat Brown 14-0. In the 1939 Rose Bowl, undefeated and heavily favored Duke led the game 3-0 until the final minute, when USC's Doyle Nave threw to Al Kruger for the first point scored on Duke that season, and the upset for the men of Troy. The 1942 edition of the Rose Bowl, coming less than a month after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, was played in Durham, North Carolina, as Oregon State beat Duke 20-16. General Bob Neyland, who coached 21 years at Tennessee, was a great defensive innovator. His strategies are still used today. In 1959, Billy Cannon of top-ranked LSU saved a victory against Ole Miss with one punt return. Tiger coach Paul Dietzel forbid his players to handle punts within the 20. But down 3-0 in the fourth quarter, Cannon took matters into his own hands and won the game. Dietzel would later say, "That was the greatest run I ever saw in football." Remember the famed Doug Flutie Hail Mary victory of 1984? Jim McMahon at BYU preceded him by 4 years, with this pass to beat SMU in the 1980 Holiday Bowl. And everyone remembers Wrong Way Regal's great gaffe in the Rose Bowl of 1929. Another crazy play took place in the 1954 Cotton Bowl, when Dickie Nagle of Rice was on his way down the sideline when an Alabama player came off the bench to tackle him. The culprit, Tommy Lewis, explains.
Carrying the ball, and they turned our defensive end for a flip, and Nagle turned the corner, and when he did, I turned to my right and told a boy who was one of our greatest running backs at Alabama, a boy named Corky Thorpe. I said, "Corky, he's going all the way." And then when I turned my head back, he was right in my line of sight, and I hit him. I tackled him before I realized what I was doing. Certainly, if I had been thinking about this, I would have at least had my headgear on, but I hit him bareheaded. I would prefer to be known as a very average fullback who played for Alabama in the early 1950s. But as so many people know me as the idiot or the nut that came from the sideline and tackled a guy in the Cotton Bowl. I had a childhood dream of playing football for the University of Alabama. If I could just be on their team, just be on their bench, I'd be satisfied. Of course, I've got a reputation there of not staying on anybody's bench for any period of time.
And anyone who's seen it will never forget the Cal-Stanford game of 1982. When trailing 20-19 with 4 seconds left, Cal took the squib kick and lateraled the ball 5 times on the way to scoring the winning touchdown, right through the Stanford band, which had charged the field in anticipation of a win that never came.
We hope you've enjoyed our look back to the first century and a quarter of college football. And that along the way, you've relived some memories of those favorite games and special players. We've taken you from the beginning of a game to this, its 125th season. I'm Chris Lincoln, hoping you enjoy the new season, the new heroes, and the new memories as the celebration of college football continues.